Uh, Glad to see everybody who can make it today, and uh, really pleased you're with me today. Today's lecture uh, is on the 1948 war, um, sometimes referred to as the War of Independence by Israel, by Zionists, and of course by Palestinians referred to as the Nakba, or as the Great Catastrophe. So what I want to do today is sort of provide a historical. Today we're going to do a lot of history, and sort of looking at this epical moment in the development of the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? So frequently you'll hear people refer today in the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, referring back to 19. Are you someone who's from 19? Are you someone who thinks about the Arab conflict in terms of 1948, or are you somebody who thinks about it in terms of 1967? And by the end of this course, you'll really understand, at least from that perspective, why 1948 was so critical. And everything we've done in terms of thinking about the birth of Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, and more generally Arab nationalism, and then sort of the mandate period, leads up to this critical moment with the birth of Israel and the establishment of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, obviously, everything we've, as you can hear from previous lectures, Arabs living in Palestine, living in the Mandate under Britain, have been in conflict with Jews living in Palestine, living in the Mandate under Britain for quite some time, well before 1948, well before the Holocaust. So colonial powers seeking to divide up the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, between World War I and World War II, setting the stage in many ways by systematically setting up a platforming an opportunity for this conflict to intensify, is really the sort of just the first stage of this. So what I want to do today is focus on the actual years of World War II and the Israeli War of Independence, or the Nakba, as you might call it. I am just sharing my screen, obviously, and as always, we will share these slides with you. And I'm doing a lot of things all at once, in case you're wondering why I'm pausing. All right, so in a lot of ways, this begins with World War II and ends in the immediate after. Tonight, what I'm focusing on is going to begin with World War II and end in the immediate aftermath of the 1948 war. And there are a number of key developments that I want to begin with, just to sort of highlight before we get into some of the slides here. One is UN, the United Nations, adoption of its resolution, Security Council Resolution 181, which basically stipulated the partition of Palestine in 1947, after World War II. And in that moment, there are two states proposed. The Zionists assert independence right away, and we'll talk about that. The Palestinians fail in their desire to prevent that independence. And then you have the Middle East erupt in war. Neighboring Arab governments say that they're going to take over the conflict. They're going to intervene militarily in Palestine, and they fail. They totally fail to prevent the emergence of Jewish independence. The resulting independence of Israel and simultaneous Nakba, or catastrophe, the displacement of close between 710,000, 750,000 Arabs who lived in Palestine, is also going to be a long-term feature of this conflict. So you got two outcomes that are going to be, and all of these things are related to the different dimensions and consequences of World War II. So there are a couple of key things that set the context for this, right? First, of course, is the horrible, unspeakable tragedy of the Holocaust. And it's important here because it creates a consensus in the international community that the survivors of the horrors of the Shoah have to be compensated in some way. And so the conditions that are created, so this sort of gives a lot of momentum for the Zionist project. And as the international community says, this idea of never again, that is the rallying cry of Zionists, that become the rallying cry of Jews worldwide over, is a real thing. In some ways, the Zionist case becomes almost self-evident for the Western public as a result of the Holocaust. A second piece of this is that Britain, right? So the context of the powerful British Empire, which has been dominating this systemic, context, is going to change. Britain goes bankrupt after the war, and the United States becomes the leader of the free world. President Truman, as we'll see, was determined to compensate the Jewish people for the atrocities that were committed against them, and how? Of course, by facilitating Jewish, not necessarily the founding of the Jewish state, but certainly expanding Jewish immigration into Palestine. A third big piece is the emergence of the Cold War, the imposition of the Iron Curtain. Now, the world starts to divide up after World War II into communist and Western, right, United States, Soviet Union, and allies. But it's interesting, in the Middle East, the multipolarity of the Middle East continues to linger for some time after the emergence of the Cold War. For example, when Israel declares its independence, both the United States and the Soviet Union are quick to recognize its independence. And for a short time, in fact, the Soviet Union becomes indirectly Israel's main arms supplier. But the other piece, I don't know who that is, so I don't know if I'm going to let them in. Does anyone know HKMFHDQX is? Let me see. Hang on one second.
Shooting them to me.
How do I communicate with someone? Oh, hang on a second. Okay, so the other thing is that, without Britain and without Britain and without France sort of dominating in the Middle East, another factor is that Arab countries start to become you start to decolonize. Syria and Lebanon are already independent. And joins other states that gained that formal status earlier: Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. So there's this process as the former colonial powers become weak, the United States becomes strong, of decolonization. Another dimension of World War II, which is also important, was the Second Industrial Revolution, which includes the massive expansion of armed forces associated with the production of thousands of air, naval, and land forces, and they need a lot of fuel. So oil becomes an incredibly important the most important strategic resource in the Middle East of all commodities. And the Middle East, of course, because it has the world's largest oil reserves, becomes this vital region. Whereas it might have been a little bit less important before. Okay. Maybe that was Harvey before. I don't know. I don't want to be here. Okay. The last thing is so everything that I'm sorry, I've been a little distracted by the weight room and people coming in and saying that their name is blah, 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 and me wanting to make sure that I'm not going to get, Zoom bombed, or that we're not going to get Zoom bombed. All right. All of this is that there's this new balance in the world. The international community really wants a compensation for the Jewish people because of the Holocaust, and it's limited only by the growing significance of oil. And because the Arab countries have the predominant ownership of that strategic commodity, meant that their priorities, their concerns could not be ignored. So while the United States becomes the premier advocate of the rights of the Jewish people to self-determination, they also start to develop a friendship with the Saudis at the exact same time. Just to give you one example of that. Another unique dimension of this period is that the United Nations is this new organization and becomes, it's yet to become part of the Cold War. It's still considered kind of neutral. And so it's very, very powerful as an instrument of international relations. And it produces the most important decisions regarding the Middle East in 1947. Okay, so let's start talking about a little bit about the Holocaust. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these things, but I find it useful to sort of, on an emotional level, to sort of try to understand sort of the Holocaust was this process, and it happens from the 1933 to the end of the war. In 1933, around 1933 to 36, German laws increasingly restrict Jewish social, economic, and political life. There's a law for the restoration of the professional civil service, meaning no Jews in the professional service, civil service in Germany. That's in 1933, right? The number of Jews that are allowed to go to public schools and public university in Germany in 1933 are restricted. Jewish participation in medical and law societies, including restricted reimbursement of Jewish doctors by the German public health funds, is restricted. In 1934, the Nazis said that Jewish actors can't perform on the stage or on the screen. And that's just national laws. There are a lot of local laws. But the big change really becomes very apparent in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws, which say that Jews cannot be citizens in the Reich. They can't, and Germans cannot marry Jews or have sex with Jews. That's a crime, actually. You are also, in 1935, you're not allowed to vote if you're Jewish. You're not allowed to hold public office if you're Jewish. And how do you define it? This is important. Jews were not just the religious Jews who said that they were Jewish. There were a lot of German Jews who were like completely disconnected from their Jewish, culture, religion. They wanted to be Germans. They want, just like a lot of American Jews are completely assimilated. These were completely many, but the Third Reich in 1935, the Nuremberg law said if 3 of your 4 grandparents are Jewish, I don't care what you think or how you call yourself. If 3 of your 4 grandparents are Jewish, you're defined as Jewish by these laws. There's a whole wave of anti-Semitic legislation by local areas, a lot of segregation. Jews are being pushed into ghettos, not quite formalized yet. And then in 1938, November of 1938, you've got Kristallnacht. But before that, in 1936, you got the Olympics. And Germany's hosting the Olympics in Berlin, and they kind of toned down their rhetoric, their anti-Jewish rhetoric and anti-Semitic laws, so that the world won't disapprove of them so much. And then they come back in 1937, 1938, and they actually pass laws that say Jewish doctors cannot treat non-Jews. All Jewish lawyers' licenses are revoked. And then there's Kristallnacht on November 9th, which is this night, the night of broken glass, which we're all familiar with, where there was like a pogrom against Jewish-owned stores in middle-class areas throughout cities throughout Germany. Now, right after Kristallnacht, Jews are barred from all public schools, universities, cinemas completely. And everybody has to carry a Jewish identification card. 1939, Germany invades Poland. And they create ghettos in occupied Poland. In 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union, and they start the policy of killing, of mobile killing units, where they round up the Jews in all these small towns all throughout Poland and Soviet Union, and they shoot them all. Or they have these mobile gas trucks, which would be hooked up to an enclosed building, and they shove all the Jews in there, and then they gas them to death. The Germans and their collaborators killed between 1 and 1.5 million people by these shooting operations or these gas vans in the occupied Soviet Union areas until they evacuated the Soviet Union in 1944, excuse me. Now in 1941, the final solution starts, right? We're gonna stop messing around with just shooting people. Now we're going to, Himmler authorizes a plan to systematically murder all the Jews in the occupied areas of Poland. And that establishes the concentration camps of Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka. And then we get these images, right? The Auschwitz Gateway, excuse me. And if you want to see more about this, about the Holocaust, I definitely send you to this link to the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which is an incredible, rich archive of tons of photographs and detailed information about the Holocaust. I just wanted to highlight a few more things about the Holocaust. 1942, Auschwitz-Birkenau starts to operate. and over 1.1 million Jews would be murdered there. And you can see here trains from all over Europe brought people into Auschwitz, which is right here in the middle. And you can see here, it's sort of the beginnings of that experience of being rounded up and sent onto the trains coming into Auschwitz, people being segregated immediately to be sent to the death. The lines, one line goes to death, one line goes to work. These are sort of the last relatively peaceful moments together before being driven into gas chambers. So we're talking about millions systematically being bussed in across the of Europe to be, you know, the final solution is to exterminate all the Jews. And that's exactly what they almost achieved. 2/3 of European Jews are murdered. Overall, right, and there were a lot of other groups that were also murdered. The Gypsies, where there was genocide against this much smaller group, the Gypsies, gay people, anybody who was a communist, anybody who opposed the Third Reich, anybody who was friendly or tried to help Jews got caught. Overall, the Germany murdered 10 million people this way, 10 million people systematically. Now, in terms of the course, right, you know, Palestine has become really, really, really important to the Jews, right? As a place to save people and to house any survivors. Zionism and the fate of the remnant of European Jewry become intertwined. Now, Britain, meanwhile, is under intense military pressure. They're fighting a war. World War II is not just in Europe, and in once again, we're fighting in the Middle East, and a key asset for the British in World War II is the Red Sea port of Suez, which is this major supply depot for goods reaching British forces in Egypt. Meanwhile, Palestine is also seen as a training area, right? Still British Palestine, as a training area for British troops. So all of a sudden, what this sort of colonial enterprise that wasn't all that important strategically, all of us, because of oil, because of the Suez Canal, because of Palestine as a training place for the troops, becomes incredibly important. So you can see this so important here, this Suez Canal to link the Mediterranean Sea into the Indian Ocean. And if you're Russia, you can actually bring goods through the Black Sea, through the Straits of Tiran, past the Dardanelles Strait. I'm sorry, the Dardanelles Straits into this area. You've got Greece here, and you can see how powerfully important this becomes. This is another way to look at it a little bit larger, just to take a look and see, you know, here's Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Transjordan, and you can see how important that this piece of land of Palestine and the Suez Canal is to the British here. Not only because of that, but Haifa is a site of an oil refinery, which was the major source of fuel for the British fleet for oil that was sent by pipeline from Iraq into Haifa, where it's refined. Now, the British in World War II are seeking Arab support. They want the Arab countries to help them rather than the Germans along the Egyptian border. A foreign secretary, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, therefore promises that he'll support Arab unity, Arab nationalism, including accepting Syrian independence after the war. The point is to get Arabs to support the British goals to oppose Germany, right? Now, obviously, the Zionist leaders are kind of freaked out about this, right? This is now after, remember the history from last week, 1936 to 1939, there was already this huge violent outbreak in the British Mandate against Jews, but also against the British forces. The British respond in a way that the Zionists are surprised at by writing a white paper in 1939, a policy paper saying that they're going to restrict immigration into Palestine and that they're going to back away from the Balfour recognition of a homeland for Jews in the Middle East. So now Anthony Eden's saying we want to support Arab nationalism, becomes even more threatening. Now, David Ben-Gurion, who's the leader of the Yeshuv, he's the primary leader of the Jewish people in the Mandate now, says, we can't think about this, right? We know what's going on in Europe right now. We know how it's an existential issue for the Jews as a people, and we're talking about millions of our brothers and sisters and daughters and sons who are being murdered. So we have to make Palestine a reality as a place that Jewish immigrants can come. So the white paper can't be something we're going to focus on. We have to behave as if we were already the state in Palestine, and until we actually become the state in Palestine. So Jewish leaders are not going to wait at this point in time for legal immigration. And so they start to bring in Jews illegally. In 1939, there were 28,000 immigrants who arrive, and about 11,000 of them are brought in illegally. With the war starting, with the invasion of Poland starting in September of 1939, the plans to transfer even more refugees intensifies. And the Zionists and the British are having a conflict over this, both in Palestine, but also in London. They're arguing about this. Now, the British say, look, if you're going to come to Palestine illegally, violating our 1939 white paper, we're going to take you, we're going to put you in an internment camp. And we're going to send, like the British basically decide all those refugees are in these internment camps in Palestine. We're going to send them out to Mauritius Islands in the Indian Ocean. They also say, let's stop the flow of refugees into Palestine, and they try to get Turkey to deny any ships coming through to get to Palestine. And of course, the Jews are incredibly upset about this, given what's happening with the Holocaust and the murder program in Soviet Union and Poland. And the British are incredibly angry with the Zionists, who they feel like, you guys are asking for special attention when we're trying to win a world war. We're fighting a world war, and you guys want all the special attention for your little issue here in Palestine. Right, so they're seeing things quite differently. And a couple of catastrophes result. In 1940, just to give you a sense of how chaotic things are becoming during this war, over 1,700 refugees from 2 ships were intercepted by the British naval patrols and transferred to another ship, the SS Patria, that's in the Haifa port. And that the idea was that was going to go to Mauritius Island in the Indian Ocean. 1,700 people. So the Haganah decides, well, we're going to disable the ship. So they put a bomb on the hull of the ship to disable it. and to force the Jews to force the British to allow the Jews to stay there. But the ship sank and a couple of hundred people died. The Zionists say, look, we wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for the British, and they blame the British. The British cabinet actually allowed the survivors to stay in Palestine. One more incident, the Struma, another ship. I'll show you pictures of this, right? So here's the Struma ship. Here's the USS, the Patria, the SS Patria. And forgive me for butchering the pronunciation of these things. The Struma is a boat with 769 Romanian Jews who are, which is in terrible disrepair, and it's trying to get into Palestine, but Turkey's stopping it in Istanbul in December of 1941. British are telling the Turks to stop it. Don't let it into the Mediterranean. Don't let it go all the way to Palestine. And they're talking for a couple of months. They're negotiating, the British, the Turks, the Zionists. Eventually, the Turks send the ship back into the Black Sea, and it sinks. And there's only one survivor. And again, the British are blamed by the Zionists. So now the Zionists are very, right, the Yeshuv community, Ben Gurion, the leadership of the Haganah, they're not seeing the British as their allies. They're seeing the British as pulling back from the Balfour. They're seeing the British as turning away refugees during an emergency. Another issue of contention is this idea that the Chaim Weizmann, if you recall from last week, had proposed that there be a Jewish division to fight alongside with the British, with a Zionist flag. And the idea was that they would be alongside the British, flying the Zionist flag, fighting against the Nazis. Now, the Jewish Agency wants the Haganah. Remember, the Haganah is the defense. That's what it means in Hebrew, literally. They want them involved because they want the Jewish soldiers to get some defense experience, and this is critical, to have access to the British arms. And in fact, Haganah agents carry out a lot of different raids to steal arms from storage facilities in Palestine, in the Western Desert. And they get cooperation from Jewish soldiers and Jewish guards who are helping or assisting with the British. And by 1942, 1943, they had over 12,000 pistols, 18,000 rifles, 450 machine guns and automatic rifles, 100 submachine guns, 162 machine guns. Now, the British they're not stupid. They know what's happening, but they need the Haganah to cooperate in case the Germans break through in Egypt. And once that danger of Germany breaking through in Egypt fades, British, they want their arms back. And they actually put British and Jewish soldiers who had cooperated with the Zionist Haganah on trial. Now, what this does is actually creates a whole bunch of Jewish resistance. So you've got this front. By 1944, Zionist leadership in Palestine was saying, hey, we have the right to arm ourselves, not only against the Arabs who want to destroy us, but also against British authority. So the British are not getting along so great with the Zionists. And Ben Gurion and Weizmann decide, let's go to the United States. So they go to the Biltmore Hotel in New York City in May of 1942. And they decide that they're going to try to get they're trying to get Zionist movement established in the United States that is going to be a little bit more forward thinking about opening up Palestine for immigration, and and particularly for Ben Gurion in terms of his individual conflict with Chaim Weizmann, which I'll get to in a minute. He wants more control in Palestine over the immigration there. The idea is that American Jews could be motivated and mobilized in light of the Holocaust to pressure US leaders, including the President of the United States. In fact, by 1944, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party platforms endorse the independence of a Jewish state. This is 1944. 1948 is when the Declaration of Independence comes. And you can see it's already a bipartisan affair, American support for Israel. On the other hand, America still is reluctant to accept Jewish refugees, and they're turning away boats full of refugees from Europe, and a lot of it is anti-Semitism, but a lot of it is also a fear of diverting war materials to another issue. So you see that this conflict between Ben Gurion and Weizmann internally is continuing, and I'm going to show you. They're really kind of arguing a little bit about what's the appropriate way to approach this. What's the right Zionist policy at this terrible moment in world Jewish history? Ben Gurion is angry that Weizmann is still trying to deal with the British, still trying to use diplomacy to achieve Zionist goals. And he wants instead for Zionist policy to center around the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, not Jewish leadership in Europe. And look, Ben Gurion chairs the Jewish Agency Executive, and he challenges Weizmann's right as the leader of the World Zionist Organization to suggest any policy for Zionism without Ben Gurion's approval. Weizmann turns around and accuses Ben Gurion of political assassination. Weizmann wants to get the British to revive the 1937 Peel Commission, the partition plan that had an international cutaway for Jerusalem, Arab state in the south, and Jewish state in the north. Ben Gurion, on the other hand, says, no, we want all of Western Palestine, and we can get there through direct action. And we can get there with the pressure that we can generate in the United States, not by staying with London. So Winston Churchill, 1943, says, look, maybe we ought to revisit our 1939 white paper. And he comes out with this commission that says, look, we can go back to a partition plan, a two-state solution. But that's Churchill, and that's the prime minister. But then he's got Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, who is backed by military 5 people. All right, I'm just Eden is just opposed to this whole idea, right? The War Cabinet was almost ready to approve a partition plan as an official British policy after the war. And Weizmann and Ben Gurion are both aware of this. The white paper had kind of been suspended by Churchill not officially, but they weren't implementing it. They were allowing more immigration into Palestine. And then a Jewish militia group, Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, Lehi, which was formerly known as the Stern Gang, assassinated Lord Moyne, who was the deputy minister of state for Middle East affairs for Britain, who's stationed in Cairo. And more importantly, he's a very close friend of Churchill. And when this happens, Churchill is very upset, and he says, "If our dreams for Zionism are to end in the smoke of the assassin's epistle, and our labors for its failure to produce only a new set of gangsters worthy of Nazi Germany, many like myself will have to reconsider the position we've maintained so consistently in the past." So partition is off the table now. And in fact, it won't be back on the table until Churchill's out of office. The Zionists back off all this underground activity for a little while because they know that this assassination, this rogue militia, Lehi, is threatening the potential for getting the state that they so desperately need. Which brings up my next point, which is the role of the Jewish underground in this lead up, right? So there's this very active Jewish underground responding to the despair that the 1939 white paper produces. Remember, just to sort of get this back in your mind, this frame, you've got the Holocaust starting, murdering people. You've got Britain saying we're done with immigration into Palestine of Jews. You've got the United States saying we're not taking any more Jews. Britain actively turning away ships and trying to keep them out. You've got illegal immigration taking place. There's a lot of despair. So there's a creation of an Irgun, which is a revisionist militia group. Remember Zev Jabotinsky? And Jabotinsky forms the Irgun as an alternative to the Haganah to shift focus away from concern about the Arabs to a focus on the British. And they start attacking British buildings, British police, bombing gathering places. Now, Jabotinsky eventually says, wait, we're fighting against the Nazis. The British are ramping up their effort against the Nazis. Maybe we should back off our battle with the British. Everybody in his group, all of the different militias who are radical militias under the revisionist Zionism of Jabotinsky, agree to this. Everybody, the Lehi, the Irgun, everybody except the Stern gang. This is Abraham Stern. It was a very small faction. They engaged in things like robbing the Histadrut Bank, assaulting British officials. Stern gang even went so far as to seek out contracts with German and Italian representatives because they were anti-British. That's how out there they were. All that mattered to them was taking down the British so that Jews could come back into Palestine. Now, of course, the Haganah and even the Irgun condemned the Stern gang, and they helped the British police track that gang down, and Stern was eventually killed by the British police in a raid in February of 1942. Menachem Begin, and that name should sound familiar to most of you, takes over the Irgun in 1942 after Jabotinsky dies in 1940. So Menachem Begin, you can sort of see this line of this political hereditary line of the revisionist Zionists, the ones who under Jabotinsky say we need an iron wall. That's the only thing that's going to protect Jews. And Menachem Begin is his student his follower and takes over his Irgun in 1942. He eventually will go on to become the first Likud prime minister in 1977. Very important leader. Now, members of the Stern gang who had escaped from prison now got a new group, the Lehi, Fighters for Freedom of Israel, which I told you about. And one of those folks, just to call your attention to this, one of those fighters for the Lehi members is Yitzhak Shamir, who in 1980, Yitzhak Shamir becomes the foreign minister in Begin's government. And in 1986, Shamir becomes the prime minister of Israel himself. And they're basically saying, look, Lehi says, we want a Jewish state in all of Palestine, in all of Transjordan, and all the way up north into parts of southern Lebanon and Syria. Haganah was completely opposed to this. They want to do a partition deal because they think that's a possibility. They think that's pragmatic. Lehi is driven by a maximalist position. So after the assassination of Lord Moyne, which completely trashes the commitment that Churchill would have had to a two-state solution in 1944, the Haganah, led by Ben-Gurion, says we gotta take out our Irgun and our Lehi forces. They're becoming a problem, and Ben-Gurion finally gets to them, and gets them to agree to stop fighting against the British, and Lehi leaders agree to suspend their operations because of Ben-Gurion's efforts. Now, Begin's refusal to, he's the leader of Irgun, his refusal to retaliate against Haganah and Haganah's inability to destroy the Irgun kind of lead the Irgun to become a increasingly credible force as a Zionist force within Mandate Palestine, leading up to the independence. So Irgun starts to rise in importance. Lehi is really kind of trashed at this point. Okay, before I start talking about Palestinian Arab leadership, I'll take a minute break and I'll just ask if there are any questions or points you guys want to make. I see Michael raising his hand. Go for it.
Okay, first thing I want to mention about what you call Lehi. And Lehi sounds more like something the Mormons would have. In Hebrew, it's Lehi.
Thank you. I knew I'd said it wrong.
Okay,
I really appreciate that, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, well, my father was a member, and it means, I give the translation, is Lochamei Cherut Israel, which means fighters of freedom of Israel. The Stern was their leader, and
Right.
so the British negatively called them the Stern Gang. We didn't call them the Stern Gang. We called them Lehi.
Freedom fighters.
Okay,
Yes.
and we were proud of them. The other thing I want to say, I don't know if you want to add a few words about what are the causes for the Holocaust. Why would they want to kill them all? Why would they want to kill all the Jews?
Well, I think
My
that's
opinion on that.
well, first of all, Michael, I think that I could teach. I mean, I couldn't teach it, but there are classes and books written on that topic.
Of course, but a few words.
Challenging topic. There are a lot of reasons why. There was a long-standing hatred of the Jews in Europe, but there was also an effort to exploit that anti-Jewish, old historical anti-Semitism throughout Europe as a way for a radical party on the right to exploit that to rise to power, and to promise other Germans who had been gotten a very from their perspective, bad deal out of the end of World War I, to find somebody to blame, and to put their finger on, and that Hitler was going to rise up and
But
solve
the
their problem.
Holocaust happened. The Holocaust started in 41. Okay, so this beyond the election extremism. The other question that I have is if you would want to shed a few words about Kristallnacht. How did it happen?
I'm not an expert. I don't.
Okay, let me tell you a quick, short 2 sentences.
Very briefly, because we have so much. I'm on slide 10 of 40.
I would not take the class time.
I want to do it. I'm not opposed to doing this. I think it's important.
2 minutes. Okay, I would not have brought up this particular point only because it is whitewashed all over the writings on the Holocaust. Kristallnacht is typically told as an uprising of the German people, the Austrian people, for the murder of the ambassador to Austria. This is not true. I have a book written by the director of a university in this country, who is the dean of the Martin Luther Institute. He was a Nazi youth himself, was born and raised in Germany, and he told the story in the book. He says it was done as a gift to Martin Luther. It was done on his birthday. That's how it came about.
Okay. So, well, one thing's for sure, the Holocaust, thank you very much, Michael, for sharing that with us, and I'll be interested to learn more about that. I will say that the rise of a right-wing dictator in Europe, right? We can talk about the recipe of all right-wing dictators to scapegoat others who are, but there's something unique also about this, about the Shoah, and I don't want to sound like I'm just saying it's just like every other right-wing dictator. It's not. Yeah, this was a unique and a uniquely horrible moment in the history of the Western world and in the history of the world. But it certainly affects the politics of the Arab, of the Zionist movement, and the inability of the Arab leadership to stop it. But there's another piece to this, and I told you a little bit about the divisions within Zionism, and Michael told you a little bit more. But on the Palestinian Arab side, right, there was this Arab Higher Committee that that kind of fell apart after the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt. The Raghib al-Nashishibi, who was much more moderate in terms of wanting to deal with the British, and Haj Amin al-Husseini, who had been the much more hardline Palestinian leader, were split. And there were a lot of leaders after the 1936 to 1939 revolt that had to go into exile or had been arrested by the Brit. The ones who had left to avoid being captured by the British. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti, now is banned from Palestine after he escaped in 1937. And but the British were concerned now about fighting against the Germans again. And you recall that they'd reached out to his grandfather back in 1919. Now they're reaching out to Haj Amin al-Husseini to try to get him to help bring Arabs on the side of the British. And the way they thought they would do that is to promise that they will put in place even harsher restrictions on Jewish immigration into Palestine. That's what the British are promising the Arabs. But Haj Amin al-Husseini says, no way, I'm not dealing with the British, right? Just like the Zionists, he shares the hatred of the British. And he said, like, you fooled me once, fooled me twice, fooled me third time, I'm not going to do it again. He's out, and he rejects that. Instead, he goes to Germany. I'm going to just move ahead for a second. I'll come back to this, right? And this is the infamous picture of Haj Amin al-Husseini going to Hitler saying, hey, the British, they don't want to help us kick out the Zionists, kick out the Jews. You are killing all the Jews in Europe. Can you help us get our state in our land back? Meanwhile, right, this is not doing so well for Palestinian people because, you know, that doesn't look so great. There are other members of the Arab Higher Committee that say this is ridiculous and we want to work with the British. With the Mufti out in Germany and discredited for his work with Hitler, the leadership field is completely open. So there's this competition for who's going to lead the Palestinian Arab community. One leadership is this new party, Istiqlal, which is a secular Palestinian independence party, who are pretty hard line, right? They want to use, there's this growing economic boom in World War II in Palestine because of the importance of the region. And they want to use that as a means to boost Arab resistance to the Zionists. They got control of the Arab National Bank. They're trying to mirror the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish agency, and the Arab National Fund. And they use that to start to buy land from Palestinian notables that Zionists might have purchased otherwise. So if you recall last week, one of the big concerns that the Arabs in Palestine were having was that Zionists, through the Jewish agency, through the Jewish National Bank, were figuring out ways to purchase legally land from Palestinian landholders, large Palestinian landholders in Palestine. And so Istiqlal is trying to get money to purchase that land for Palestinians. And that gets a lot of attention for them. They open this Arab National Fund and this Arab National Bank all over the branches all over the Middle East and throughout Palestine, and even peasants are contributing to this money. And it gets the imagination of the Arab people, it fires them up that they can fight back here. They can fight back against Jewish land purchases. But Haj Amin al-Husseini sees this as a direct threat to his own efforts to regain leadership. The other thing about Istiqlal is it has, like Haj Amin al-Husseini had before, is it has a lot of appeal among the peasants. It's not just an elite party. So there is this conflict. There's this rising leadership fight among Palestinians. The truth is, Istiqlal, Haj Amin al-Husseini, Raghib al-Nashashibi, none of them are proposing anything that would be acceptable to the Zionists. And bottom line is the Palestinian public opinion is completely opposed to the Jewish state. But the conflict among the leaders means that the representation of the Palestinian cause is now going to devolve down to the heads of the neighboring Arab regimes. And that continues all the way through 1948. There's nobody who can really speak for the Palestinians, qua Palestinians. There's so much division. So that's one of the reasons why Jordan and Syria and Egypt and Lebanon and Iraq all get involved. Most of the Arab leaders are focused on regional unity. And that's what Anthony Eden is trying to support. He's promising the Arabs that they'll get self-government. This captures the imagination of al-Said in Iraq, the prime minister in the new prime minister in Egypt. And then there are other plans for Arab unity that are in competition with that. There's a Fertile Crescent scheme that, and I want to point this out because it lays the groundwork for ongoing conflicts between different groups. So this one is a scheme that really excludes, notice what it excludes. It's Transjordan, it's Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, no Egypt here, right? Egypt's excluded from this. The Iraq and Transjordanian governments were governed both by a Hashemite family that were related to each other. And they wanted control over any future Arab government. The Syrian nationalists, on the other hand, considered themselves the natural leaders of the Arab state. So you've got Egypt, you've got Syria, you've got Iraq and Jordan, each thinking that they will be in control of a international, sort of like not transnational Arab country. So you've got, I want to highlight that and go back again. You've got Palestinian conflicts over leadership. There's no clear leadership there. And you've got Arab nations surrounding Palestine and not agreeing at all about which direction to go. And so those disputes kind of roil Arab politics well into the 1960s. The Saudis and the Egyptians versus the Syrians, for example. And you can see it even today, right? Now, in 1944, October, there's an effort to try to overcome some of these conflicts. And the Arab heads of state get together, they go to Alexandria, Egypt, and they issue an Alexandria Protocol, which calls for the League of Arab States that would further coordinate all of the political and commercial activities of the Arab world. Palestine, in their protocol, is singled out as a basic important focus. And here's what they say. They said that Palestine is such an important part of the Arab world that the rights of the Arabs in Palestine cannot be touched without prejudice to peace and stability in the rest of the Arab world. They don't use the rest. And they also say the pledge is binding the British government and providing for the cessation of Jewish immigration, the preservation of Arab lands, and the achievement of independence for Palestinian are permanent Arab rights. So here's the first uniting of the Arab world on behalf of Palestine and against Zionism. And they're trying to exert pressure on Britain. The protocol also said the following, I'm going to read this quote. The committee also declares that it is second to none in regretting the woes which have been inflicted upon the Jews of Europe by European dictatorial states. Holocaust, right? But the question of these Jews should not be confused with Zionism, for there can be no greater injustice and aggression than solving the problem of the Jews of Europe by another injustice, i.e. by inflicting injustice on the Arabs of Palestine of various religions and denominations. This is in some ways the heart of the Arab argument against Zionism to the present day. That's a European issue, and it shouldn't be made our issue, right? This League of Arab States was formed in 1945, and that stress on Arab unity becomes critical. Now, King Ibn Saud, the Saudi leader, meets with FDR in 1945. And FDR promises, look, okay, no, we're not going to do anything in Palestine without consulting with other Arab leaders. And this is an informal statement. It's not it's not written out, but this is a statement that FDR is making this promise to the Saudis as a way, and it seems like it contradicts what America has been saying all along in terms of what the Democratic Party platform says, what the Republican Party platform says in terms of its endorsement of the Jewish home in Israel. But at the same time, it reflects America's concern for oil and for its economic position. It doesn't really mean all that much because FDR dies in April of 1945, and Truman has a very different set of ideas about how to resolve the issue of Palestine. Now, Churchill has been defeated, and you got a Labor government. Remember, Churchill was the one who said, I will not deal with the Jews after the assassination of Lord Moyne by Leahy. Did I say it correctly, Michael? Did I do better?
Cheryl?
Yes, you do good.
Okay. All right. So Churchill is out of the picture, and now you've got Prime Minister Clement Attlee. And the Labor Party in 1944 says, not only are they going to call for a Jewish state in Palestine, but they want to transfer the Arab population that's in Palestine into Transjordan. And so they're talking about moving Arabs out of Palestine and into Transjordan in order to create a Jewish state there. Now, the Zionists are getting excited. This is a possibility that they're going to get they're going to get this state. But once again, there's an effort to push back against the British, an effort to set a bomb in the I'm sorry, come back to it in a minute. I'm getting out of order. Let me come back to this in a minute. And I'll come back to that picture, that horrible picture, bombing of the British hotel in Jerusalem, the King David Hotel, sorry, in Jerusalem, where the headquarters of the British military was. But let me come back to that in a minute. So after the Second World War ends, we've got a transformation from a multipolar to a bipolar distribution of power. But the Cold War hasn't really begun yet. The bipolar system creates a multilateral system of diplomacy. So you've got United States, Soviet Union, but you got this United Nations representing many, many different countries. And the United Nations role was critical, particularly in that region's development, including the 1947 United Nations Partition Plan. Second thing, as I mentioned before, Britain is now economically broke, and it has to get out of every area east of Suez in the Middle East, including Palestine. The European war ends 1945, May of 1945. The war against Japan ends in August of 1945. But for Britain, in the Middle East, it's facing nationalist demands for independence from all sorts of former colonies, and an economic crisis that is going to last for years and years, which seriously weakens its ability to sustain any kind of imperial rule. So in 1946, Jordan becomes independent. 1946, Syria becomes independent. Lebanon had already become independent. The British and French mandates have been formally terminated. And this kind of signals the beginning of a broader trend of decolonization that took place throughout Asia and Africa. And And that goes on all the way through the 60s as Europeans give up their colonies. At the same time, you've got a new Arab League that has been established in Cairo, as I mentioned before, with a new regional dynamic that recognizes the independence of each individual Arab state. These are brand new independent countries, right? And they're forming this this unity, this Arab League. The aftermath of the war also sort of weighs very heavily on President Truman. Truman was deeply impacted by the Holocaust personally, and he starts to pressure the British to ease restrictions on immigration to Palestine. He wants Britain to grant special certificates of entry to Palestine to 100,000 Jewish refugees, which would exceed the 1939 white paper quotas. And now with Clement Attlee as the prime minister in Britain, he's likely to succeed. Truman proposes an Anglo-American committee between Britain and the United States to look into what to do with the refugees after this war and to make some recommendations. That committee goes all the way throughout Europe and the Middle East and comes back to the United Nations and comes back and gives a report that says that the United Nations should have a permanent control of the entire area of Palestine, and that the United Nations should immediately repatriate 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine from Europe. And then Truman says, okay, that's first thing that we'll propose, right? That's the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry from 1946. Then Truman appoints Henry Grady, who's a career diplomat, to meet with Herbert Morrison, a British official in charge of Palestinian affairs, and they come up with the Morrison-Grady plan. And their committee basically issues this plan in late 1946, which calls for the division of Palestine into 3 autonomous regions: a British sector, which is half the territory, including Jerusalem, a much smaller Arab sector, and a Jewish area that would be less than 20% of the entire country. Arabs said no way. Zionists said no way. By 1947, you've got US public opinion 2-1 in favor of a Jewish state in Palestine. Truman commits America for the very first time to supporting the Jewish demand for statehood. But his administration, he kind of goes against his own administration, his own State Department, who's advising him not to do this. The oil is too important. The Arab nations are too important. But Truman is convinced personally, and he's the president, so he comes out in favor of American statehood. For the longest time, I didn't understand why my grandparents felt that Truman was the greatest president in the history of the United States. I was like, he's probably pretty good, but like, I mean, he made a few mistakes, and FDR, but they were convinced that, and then as I started to study this, I realized why, because it was Truman who, against the advice of his own advisors, decided that that the United States would endorse Israel's independence as a country before, right? In the meantime, you've got Zionist underground troops continuing to smuggle in thousands and thousands, over 100,000 Jewish refugees from displaced person camps all across Europe into Palestine by 1948. Then President Truman is establishing the fact that the United States is the world leader after World War II. United States is going to be engaged in an effort through the Truman Doctrine to fight a Cold War against communism and contain communism everywhere in Eastern Europe, in every post-war developing country, to keep communism out, and also to rebuild Western Europe. And that includes military aid to Greece and Turkey. The reason why this is important in terms of the Palestinian Arab-Israeli conflict is because now the United States is the most important player here. You could see part of this is including pushing back against Russia's desires to sort of control the Bosporus Straits and the Dardanelles Straits here, assistance to Turkey and to Greece, but military assistance from the United States to Turkey and Greece is part of the Marshall Plan, really important. And you can see why that's important from this map here. If you see where my pointer is, the Black Sea up here, and you can see this is the route from Russia into the Middle East. And here is Palestine, Israel, Palestine, in this area here. And here's Greece and Turkey. So the United States is starting to see itself strategically as containing both communism, but also having a role to play, a leadership role to play in resolving what's going to happen in the Middle East. Now, so when just one more thing I wanted to talk about, Zionist resistance intensifies as the British continue to resist Jewish immigration after the war. The Lehi are pushing back. They're attacking a bunch of British soldiers, and then the Haganah, Irgun, had raids on different British railway installations. Clement Attlee, who was favorable to the Zionist plan, wants to crush Zionist resistance, and he raids the headquarters of the Jewish Agency, and he arrests a whole bunch of Haganah leaders to try to disrupt their resistance to British presence. Tons of documents are taken. 2,700 people are arrested. The Irgun under Menachem Begin reacts by blowing up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which is where we were back here. Now, the idea was there was not going to be anybody there. They decided to blow up the King David Hotel, which was where the British administrative offices are for the mandate, when no one's there. But there unfortunately were quite a few people there, and 91 British people are killed, including Jews, including Arabs who are working there. Churchill at that time says in the House of Commons says that Palestine isn't worth it. It's not that important to Britain. It's not worth all these casualties. And other British leaders swore revenge. Yeah, Michael, please.
Sorry. I want to add on that. I have been researching this very topic of the King David Hotel, and it actually was presented in the British Parliament that the Irgun gave the British who were holding their military headquarters at that hotel, they gave them a 30 minutes warning, but they ignored it.
They ignored the warning. That's absolutely true.
That's the evidence presented in the British Parliament, and that was the reason for so many casualties. But they gave them a warning, a fair warning.
They actually they thought that the British were not even going to be in their offices. I think they did it on a Sunday, and they thought they weren't even going to be there, and they gave them a warning. Yes,
this is a hotel. It's not possible. They would think nobody would be there. That's a hotel.
No, but in the administrative offices, they only blew up the administrative office.
But other people died too, Jews and Arabs, and they asked him to vacate it, and he did not.
Yes, it was a big disaster. Now, after all of this has happened, right? The United Nations, at the end of 1946, you got over 1.3 million Arabs and 600,000 Jews are living in Palestine. The Arabs have a 2-to-1 majority. Jews own about 20% of the cultivable, farmable land. I can't say it. It's not a lot of land. It's only about 6% of the total land area. And the United Nations creates a special committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, to try to figure out what to do with this. Right? So the United Nations is not seen negatively by anybody, but the Arab nations immediately boycott it. The 11 nations on UNSCOP are Sweden, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Canada, India, Iran, Guatemala, Mexico, and Peru. The idea is these are going to be these are countries that don't have a lot at stake, that they can be neutral here. And UNSCOP basically says, the British mandate has to be over, and then a solid majority say that there should be a partition plan, like the Peel partition, with a Jewish state, 2-state solution, Jewish state, a Palestinian state, Jerusalem under international control. The Palestinians say, no way. This is their land. They're the majority. For the Jews, they still felt that they had a right to the state in all of Palestine, but Ben-Gurion was counseling them, be practical. Let's take the partition. Ben-Gurion was worried with the here and now, not some principle. He wanted to get refugees into Palestine. He wanted independence so that they could have some control over immigration. This is all happening while the Irgun and Lehi are still attacking British personnel. So the report proposes this partition, right? UNSCOP calls for this partition. Britain says it's going to get out of Palestine by mid-May. They're going to close down their mandate. They're going to do it unilaterally. And they're going to hand it over to the United Nations. And the United Nations is coming up with this plan of partition, right? This is the Arab state, this brown area. This is the Jewish state. This is all desert, I just want to point out, okay? That's the plan. The General Assembly of the United Nations gets together. They have an ad hoc committee to hear both Palestinian and Zionist views on the proposal. And a lot of Zionists expect that the General Assembly is going to say no way. That the non-European countries are going to sympathize with the Arabs, and that the Soviets and their allies are going to oppose the United States, that they're going to sympathize with the Arabs, that the Zionists, they weren't even sure that the United States would support them. And so they start to lobby like crazy. They start to go, Truman is on the sideline, but he writes in his memoirs, he had, quote, never had as much pressure and propaganda aimed at the White House as I had in this instance, unquote. You got congressmen and senators and Supreme Court justices sending telegrams to heads of states and their representatives, sometimes even saying that they're going to lose U.S. aid if they don't back this. On November 27th, they're about to vote, and it looks like partition's going to be defeated, but Truman basically intervenes, and he asks for more time before the vote takes place. And that seems to be what was needed for the Zionists to get their ducks in line. So the General Assembly votes 33-13 with 10 abstentions to approve the partition. The Soviets back the Zionist cause. The Zionist leadership realizes, oh, well, this is critical to the Soviets' future. United Nations issues this this UN resolution, which terminates the mandate, creates independent Arab and Jewish states, an international regime for the city of Jerusalem, and guarantees all persons equal and non-discriminatory rights in civil. Notice this one includes political, unlike the Balfour Declaration, civil, political, economic, and religious matters, and promises fundamental freedoms. What are those? Freedom of religion, language, speech, publication, education, assembly, and association. That's the UN resolution. By May 14th, so Zionists say, okay, we'll take it. The Arabs say, no way. Husseini says, UN Resolution 181 is null and void. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria says, we got to get an Arab army together to liberate Palestine. There's a strike in Damascus, 10,000 people break into the United States and the Belgian, like their embassies, legations, and the Soviets' cultural office. In Aleppo, Syria, there's a pogrom. Hundreds of Jewish homes, synagogues are burned, Jews are killed in a riot. This is just the UN is doing this, right? Mm-hmm. That didn't guarantee a Jewish state. Al-Husseini, and the Shishibi said, let's take it. Al-Husseini says, no, let's not take it. Ben Gurion coordinates, move with Irgun and Lehi, and they agree to accept it. Now, here's what I want to point out. 1948 war, and I might go on about 5 or 10 minutes, a little bit longer, I'm sorry. Starts as a civil war. It starts as a civil war in Palestine, right? And stage one, the Arab irregulars, these are, various militias, are attacking Jewish settlements. Haganah becomes defensive, protecting Jewish communities. In stage two of that civil war, violence breaks out in major cities, in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem. Irgun and Lehi fight back. They're setting off bombs. They're setting off car bombs, in heavily congregated Arab areas. A lot of civilians are dying. This is a civil war. It's nasty, right? A second offensive is launched by Haganah in April of 1948. And that's focused on a Jerusalem corridor. Let me go back for a minute. I want to show you why. You see this area here? This is very narrow. There's not a lot of room, right? So what Irgun says is, strategically, from a military perspective, unless we widen this corridor and get more control of these roads, we're going to lose this impending war. So that's what they're doing here. And they capture most of the land that they got under the UN plan, but they also add to that. Now, about 300,000 Arabs leave the country, leave Jaffa, leave Tel Aviv, leave Jerusalem, right? This is part of the beginning of the refugee crisis, the Nakba that the Palestinians perceive. Now, the Arab states are sitting around talking, trying to figure out what they want to do about UN Resolution 181, and they decide that the Arab League decides that they're going to send a military force into Palestine. Now, Egypt can't make up their mind. The prime minister of Egypt says, why are we going to get involved in this? The king says, no, I'm part of the Arab movement. King Farouk says we have to go. So on May the 15th, the day after Israel declares its independence, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq all declare war on Israel. From April to May is the fiercest fighting. Now, the Haganah had already had shipments of arms from the Soviets through Czechoslovakia, and their goal was get control over their area, the UN allotted area. That's the first thing they want to do. They're not trying to extend anything. They're just trying to get control over their area. And secondly, to say that they are a country, proclaim their Jewish state. Jerusalem, that battle is critical, right? And they're really talking about West Jerusalem. They're willing to stand down on East Jerusalem and leave that over for Jordan to keep control over. Lehi and Irgun decide to, come under the leadership of Ben Gurion. They're all fighting together. And then in Deir Yassin, an Arab village, in April 9th of 1948, after a non-aggression pact was signed with the city, there's an attack anyway. Irgun and Lehi forces attack that city. They kill 115 to 250 men, women, and children after they thought nobody's going to come in and we've already agreed to non-aggression. This becomes so terrifying to other Arab neighborhoods and villages that people just run. They leave all, they hear that the Zionists are coming and they kind of leave their cities. And that's part of the intention of this approach. On April the 14th of 1948, Israel declares its independence. And this is what they say. I'm going to read part of the Israeli independence declaration because it's so moving to me. This is what Ben Gurion is saying. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. And I'm cutting and pasting. I'm just cutting out lots of it. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for the return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. In the year 5657, 1897, at the summons of the spiritual father of the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, the first Zionist Congress convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country. This right was recognized in the Balfour Declaration, reaffirmed in the mandate of the League of Nations. And then here they connect their focus to the Holocaust. The massacre of millions of Jews in Europe was another clear demonstration of the urgency for our independence. On the 29th of November, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael. And here's what he says. Accordingly, we, members of the People Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Yisrael and of the Zionist movement, declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael to be known as the State of Israel. I thought it'd be kind of cool to hear it in Hebrew a little bit. This is just about a minute, a little bit less than a minute, but I found this pretty exciting to hear.
בארץ ישראל קם העם היהודי. בה עוצבה דמותו הרוחנית, הדתית והמדינית. בה חי חיי קוממיות ממלכתית. בה יצר נושאי תרבות לאומיים וכלל אנושיים, והוריש לעולם כולו את ספר הספרים הנצחי. לאחר שהוגלה העם מארצו בכוח הזרוע, שמר לה אמונים בכל ארצות פזוריו. לפיכך נתכנסנו, אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב היהודי והתנועה הציונית, ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל, ובתוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, על יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
The Declaration of Independence goes on to say some really important things, so I just have to read a little bit more. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. This is in 1948. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the state of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help with the sovereign Jewish people settled in its own land. The state of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East. Ben-Gurion knew that the war was coming, but he wanted to go on record as saying that they had no intentions of anything but living at peace with their neighbors. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had already fled or had been expelled. And you can see here, this is the 1947 partition plan. Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, all invade Israel in 1948. The Israeli army counterattacks, pushes back, and expands the initial partition grant from the United Nations as part of their military victory. That war, I'll come back to this a little bit more, but Israel takes all this territory. Let's just move on from the military victory part. You can look at this a little bit later. And at the end of it, there are a number of different things that happen. One is about 710,000 to 750,000 Arabs who are living in what becomes Israel leave and become refugees. Talk about that in a minute. After the war, Israel signs armistice agreements with Egypt on February 24th. And you can notice here separately with the Arab League launches this war together, but each nation has a separate armistice agreement establishing some kind of a line. It's not a border, right? But over which there will be no more military conflict. Within a border with Egypt on February 24th, a border with Lebanon on March 23rd in the north, a border with Transjordan on April the 3rd, and a border with Syria. The United Nations also says at the end of this war, in United Nations Security Council Resolution 194, that all of these Palestinians who had left, that they have the right of return, that they can come back. I want to just say one more thing about this before I take your point, Michael, and then we'll wrap up for today. The matter of Arab refugees has been in dispute ever since this moment. Israeli officials said Arabs encouraged their own people to leave these areas, that the Arabs were going to win a great victory, and that once they won the great victory, it would be safe to come back and be much easier after they defeated the Zionists. Therefore, the Israeli officials say they shouldn't be considered refugees. They were moving out of the way to win a victory. That was a military move. Others question whether Plan Dalet, this part of Deir Yassin, this idea to scare the Palestinians out of their areas, was an official order, or whether it was just an effort by individual military leaders to get Palestinians out of the way, not without killing them, right? There is a question about whether it happened or didn't happen. Some scholars say the order was given. Benny Morris, who's a revisionist historian in Israel using archival documents, very well-known historian, said the Zionist forces acted from Plan Dalet to try to get the Palestinians out of their areas, but that he says that wasn't an order given by Ben-Gurion. He didn't call for it directly. Okay, Michael.
Okay, you've done an excellent job, by the way. But I want to correct you on one thing. And at the time, there was no borders that signed between the countries. It was ceasefire lines. Okay,
Exactly.
not borders. Okay, the other thing is Israel recognized, regardless of actually the machinations, how this massacre came about, Israel recognized its responsibility and went to compensate these people, and they made what's called a sulha. Sulha is from the word forgiveness, and it's all behind them right now, okay, between the state of Israel and that village and the people. Okay, we all recognize this was the wrong thing to do. The other thing that I want to say here is on the average, the Palestinian refugee moved only 30 miles, even less. It's simply they moved to their village, the Arab village next door. Okay, that is exactly, if you look at the map, that's what it is. Okay, and finally, the Jewish position is today, and as a matter of fact, years ago, at the time of Clinton, he commissioned an investigation on the refugee problem, and the resolution came about. There was a population shift. The Jews were expelled from the Arab countries,
Yes.
and the Arabs, the Palestinians, were shifted to their countries, to the Arab countries. The Jews moved to Israel, and the Arabs moved 30 miles to their people. And that is the balance of it. Nonetheless, Israel and American presidents are willing to compensate each and every one of them, okay, for their losses and for whatever, as long as they sign final peace agreement on the dotted line saying no more claims.
Well, I think that's everything you said is important. And I wanted to point out that leading up to the War of 1948, Jews had to leave Syria, they had to leave Morocco. 325,000 Jews had to leave all these Arab areas and come into Israel. I did want to finish by saying the United Nations has set up a refugee program specifically for the Palestinians, and that there are refugee camps, as you can see here. This is from today. This is from 2021, in all sorts of places, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in the West Bank, as Michael was pointing out. People, I've been to the Aida refugee camp in the West Bank. And the heirs of those refugees, and I'll leave this link in the slide so you can explore that a little bit more. The heirs of those refugees continue to enjoy now a number in the 1.5 million, according to most estimates, that have a right to return to Israel, according to United Nations Resolution 194. But this continues to be a major piece of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I see, Robin, you've been patiently waiting, and I want to question too.
Thank you. So was wondering, I understand that there was a, and maybe I completely missed this in your description, but I understand that there was a Jordanian siege of Jerusalem in which over 100,000 Jews were facing starvation. Where does that fit into all of this? Do you know?
I think you might be talking about 1967, but I just don't know.
No, no,
Okay.
actually it happened in 1948, but it's a long story. And it's a sad story. The Jews had to leave the areas in the hands on the side of the Arab side, so they had to move back to the Jewish side. And if you know this movie Exodus,
Yes.
Yeah.
I think in Exodus, I think they show how the story happened, and there was a very a caravan of vehicles going to Jerusalem, and how they plowed a special road in order to reach them and provide them with food. It's a horrific story on its own.
I just
Okay.
wonder how, Scott, as you were talking about, the statement that the Jews had no intention of going in, and that the armies were not going to go into Jerusalem, and all of a sudden they did. And certainly understand like the bedlam and the confusion. I mean, in my head, I'm seeing all of this as,
Oh, you're talking about Deir Yassin, that
yes,
city, yes. And there were other massacres, and there were other horrible human rights violations by Israeli forces. Ari Shavid has an incredibly depressing and difficult chapter of his wonderful book, My Promised Land, about the town of Lydda, Lydda. There was a New Yorker article which featured it, where Jews exiled 10,000 Palestinians out of their town.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah.
Can I say
Wait,
that?
no, wait, Michael, I want to hear what you have
On
to
that
say.
point, I just want to say one sentence. They asked them to move 8 miles to the neighborhood village. That's all. They moved them from Lod to the neighbor. If you look at the map, it's 8 miles, and they had to move over.
Okay. I'm not, but the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, there was all sorts of, a lot of difficult things happen in war.
It's 8
That's
miles.
a way,
They didn't kill them. It was an agreement with their leadership. If they vacate, okay, and they decide to vacate and move to the next town over 8 miles away.
Okay, Michael, hang on a second. I want to just take one more point from Rob. And I definitely, there's so much more to be said about all these things. I haven't even begun to talk about this Palestinian narrative of all of this.
Yeah.
And I have a lot to say about that, but I've given you sort of a central view of this, but we'll talk about that a lot more next week. Let me take Rob's question.
Obviously, these are very complex issues. The question I have is about, in the time after 1948, in Israeli courts related to Palestinians who became refugees and left property, what sort of range of decisions were there in the decades after that among Israeli courts in terms of the property rights to the homes, for example, that the Palestinians left in various villages in efforts to kind of get them back? What was the range of responses there?
Well, you know what, I have to tell you that I don't have a good answer for you. I can't speak authoritatively about that, but I will say that there have been many cases where Arabs have been offered different homes than the home that they were exiled from, and have said they don't want to do that. They want to they'd rather stay in the refugee camp under UNRWA, the United Nations refugee support that they get, until Israel allows them back into their home where they were from. Many Palestinians will wear keys. I don't know if you know this, around their as an like on a necklace or on a bracelet. They'll carry around the key of their home, of their grandparents' home, their parents' home.
Can I answer to that question?
Wait one second, Michael. Just
That